Bienvenidos. Tiene que dar la señal. Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Los
Good
saluda
morning, ladies and gentlemen.
el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo.
This is Adela Barrio on behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank. We welcome you to the fifth technical dialogue on trafficking in persons in Latin America and the Caribbean. This event is a hybrid event. So we have people connected via Zoom and here participating in person at our headquarters in Washington, D.C. The event will be in Spanish and English with interpretation services into Spanish, English, and Portuguese.
Please click the world icon in the bottom of your screen and select the language. Las personas aquí en la sala que nos acompañan y que requieran interpretación, les pedimos solicitar el receptor en la entrada de la sala que se los podemos
If you require interpretation, please ask for the receiver at the entrance of this room.
Los invitamos además a usar nuestro
We
hashtag.
invite you to use our hashtag Se Trata de Personas on Twitter and to follow us via social networks at LBIT. The event will be divided into 4 parts. We will begin with opening remarks, then we will continue with the panel on interagency coordination, and afterwards we will announce the winners of the Gobernante contest, and then we will end with a panel discussion on the role of the private sector in the fight against human trafficking. Now I would like to invite you to the opening of the event by Fabiana Jorge, alternate executive director of the United States of the Inter-American Development Bank, who is here connected via Zoom. Susana Cordero Guerra, manager, Development Institutions Department, Inter-American Development Bank, and Ilias Jaxis, chief Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Unit, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, who's here with us today also virtually from Vienna. Go ahead, Director Fabiana.
¿Me oyen bien? ¿Se oye bien?
Can you hear me?
Sí. Ok, perfecto, gracias.
Perfect, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to cordially greet you to the fifth technical dialogue on trafficking in humans in Latin America and the Caribbean, organized by the Inter-American Development Bank. I would like to welcome the director of the Development Institutions Department, Susana Cordero Guerra, and also the chief of the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Unit from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Ilias Chatsis. In addition to this, I would like to welcome all the panelists, representatives of different security and justice institutions from Latin America and the Caribbean, colleagues from the IDB group, audience who are here with us today from the headquarters as well as virtually. Human trafficking is a global and increasing crime that affects the life, the freedom, the dignity, as well as the integrity of people throughout the world. They suffer intimidation, abuse, violence, degradation. Human trafficking affects more than 50 million children, men, and women in the world. Most of the victims are women and girls, 65% at a global level and 75% in Latin America and the Caribbean. 1 of every 3 victims in the world is a minor. Central America and the Caribbean have the highest percentage of minors as victims in the entire world. They represent 48% of victims, identified victims. behind human trafficking, we see organized crime groups, but also relatives and acquaintances of the victims, recruiters that operate as middlemen, and businesses that seem legal. The United States is also suffering from this scourge. The Victims Protection Law was approved in 2000, and the Palermo Protocol was ratified. This way, the country prioritized human trafficking in its policy through a comprehensive government approach focused on the victim. Human trafficking has also become part of the United States international cooperation agenda. For example, Biden-Harris's administration created a working group with all the different institutions in order to fight against human trafficking, and a high-level working group. However, in 2020, the Homeland Security Department created a center to fight against human trafficking. The objective of this center is to carry out operations in order to enforce the law against human trafficking, protect victims, and improve prevention efforts, aligning the capacities of the government with the experience of this agency. The Homeland Security Department also promotes the Blue Campaign in order to prevent human trafficking and protect victims. This campaign is trying to raise awareness among people, security institutions, as other stakeholders in the private sector, in order for them to know about human trafficking and also know how to properly respond to the potential cases. Several units in the Justice Department actively participate in the investigation and prosecution of human trafficking, stabilizing and supporting victims, and enlarging or increasing training in this regard. An example is the Specialized Prosecutor's Office in Human Trafficking and the Assistance and Training Office to train prosecutors abroad. Finally, our flagship example is the annual report on human trafficking. It's drafted by an office in the Department of State. It classifies the different governments based on the efforts that are carried out in order to identify and fight against human trafficking. This office is in charge of monitoring the situation and also raising awareness about human trafficking. The same office carries out diplomatic activities with other countries and funds different international initiatives to fight against human trafficking. We have a big challenge ahead, and the IDB Group has shown its commitment with the multi-sectorial work agenda in order to prevent, protect the victims, and prosecute this crime. The agenda is supported in 4 different pillars: technical dialogues, knowledge products, operative initiatives, and activities to raise awareness. The series of technical dialogues on human trafficking started in 2020. These dialogues have allowed us to deepen our technical knowledge. We've seen the importance of good coordination and partnerships, as well as a comprehensive and multi-sectoral approach in order to effectively respond to this scourge. The research agenda at the IDB addresses issues that affect both the public and the private sector. There are loan operations and grants through which the IDB is promoting institutional response to human trafficking. This approach by the IDB Group in order to address this scourge is comprehensive, is coordinated and promoted by different sectors within the IDB, such as citizen security, justice, migration, labor markets, gender and diversity, and the IDB Invest, among others. And now to close, I would like to thank everyone that has come together and joined this dialogue. Thank you for participating in this very important conversation for the region. I would also like to reiterate that given the magnitude of this crime and the vulnerability of the region, As a product of the pandemic, the IDB Group's commitment and the US government's commitment in the fight against human trafficking is even stronger today. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Fabiana. Ahora continuamos con las palabras de Susana Cordeiro Guerra.
Thank you, Fabiana. And I would like to offer the floor to Susana Cordero Guerra, Director of the Development Institutions Department. Susana, welcome. Good morning. Director Fabiana Jorge, Chief of the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Unit from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Elias Chatsis, representatives of security and justice institutions, participants of the Bien Público Regional, colleagues from the IDB. Participants are here with us today virtually and in person. Thank you for joining the 5th Technical Dialogue on Trafficking in Persons in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the 5th dialogue and it's part of a series that began at the end of 2020. Different stakeholders from various sectors have explored collective challenges and solutions to combat the crime of human trafficking. We are truly pleased to be able to hold this dialogue in person for the first time and to also have the participation of 13 countries of the region, as well as partner institutions. This provides us with enormous opportunities for exchange and collaboration. As we know, trafficking in persons is a complex crime and a serious human rights violation that involves every country in the world. Since 2003, the number of reported victims and convicted traffickers has increased. Several reasons contribute to this rise: increased poverty, inequality, and unemployment generated by the pandemic, increased exposure to digital media, and migration dynamics, among other reasons. And what can we do in the face of such a challenging and complex problem? The security and justice institutions, civil society organizations, international cooperation agencies, as well as the private sector, have participated in these technical dialogues, and they all highlight a common factor: the need to adopt a comprehensive and coordinated approach, such as the director said, that brings together different sectors and actors in order to achieve effective and long-lasting results. Apologies for my portuñol, says the speaker. Based on the discussions held in the 4 technical dialogues that have been held to date, we have identified 3 lines of action that are guiding our work in order to strengthen our capacity to respond from the security and justice sectors. Continuous training and awareness raising of officials in charge of victim assistance and investigation and prosecution of the crime of trafficking in persons. Then the creation of specialized human trafficking units in the police, the prosecutor's office, as well as the judiciary, in order to effectively address this crime. And finally, the establishment of information management systems for case management and aggregate statistics in order to measure the problem and monitor progress. In addition to this, we have also learned that it is essential to have greater knowledge of what works in our region and to foster within the competent authorities the conditions for experimentation and learning, and always involving multiple sectors and industries in order to ensure that policies in the area are viable, legitimate, and relevant. All these lessons learned, added to those that we will generate today, will allow us to move forward in building together a specific national and regional guidelines for action in response to human trafficking. These guides will address the areas of prevention, protection, and care for victims, prosecution of trafficking, as well as interagency and intra-country cooperation with a gender focus and the potential of digital technologies. Precisely, these guides are one of the products of the regional public good that we promote from the IDB with the participation of 14 countries and several strategic partners who are with us today. Thanks to the kind efforts of the US office at the IDB, we will have the great opportunity to learn firsthand about the work of 3 US government agencies with extensive and recognized experience in this area: the Department of Justice, the Department of State, and the Department of Homeland Security. Undoubtedly, all these experiences will provide valuable inputs for the development of guidelines and, more broadly, for the rapid exchange of knowledge with the countries in the region. All this work would not have been possible without the collaborations within the IDB group and regional and global alliances and partnerships, such as the one we have with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which enrich our work in this area. From the IDB's development institutions sector, I would like to invite you to continue generating solutions adapted to the contexts and needs of each country to strengthen in a sustainable manner the capacity of the state in order to prevent and provide comprehensive and coordinated responses to human trafficking. I would like to thank you all for your participation, and I wish you a very fruitful day of work. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Susana. Let's welcome now Ilias Chatsis from Vienna. Welcome, Ilias.
Thank you, Adela. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, I would like
to perfectly well.
Okay, thanks so much. I would like also to thank the alternate executive director Jorge and Ms. Guerra for outlining so eloquently the priorities of IDB against human trafficking and how important it has become the fight against this crime in the bank's overall work. So we're very appreciative of the attention you have paid to this issue. And it's a privilege for me to be with you today at this 5th dialogue on responses to trafficking in persons in Latin America and the Caribbean. The bank has been a steadfast partner of the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime for many years, supporting our alternative work, our research, and now our actions against human trafficking in the Americas. UNODC and the bank have joined efforts and developed a methodology for the first regional report against trafficking in persons, which is expected to be launched at the beginning of 2023. This cooperation will deepen in the coming years. Both our agencies will work together to improve cooperation between police forces and prosecutors' offices in the Americas that would hopefully lead to better investigations and the saving of more victims. IDB and UNODC are planning more collaborative actions to combine the technical expertise of our office and the bank's ability to undertake multi-year and multi-country initiatives. UNODC's work in Latin America and the Caribbean against trafficking in persons has been intense despite COVID-19. With our global expertise from Vienna and through our network of field offices in the region, we have been constantly assessing the trends and routes in the region and provided dedicated assistance to more than 13 countries in last year alone. Our biannual global report against trafficking in persons that is due at the beginning of next year is expected to confirm that the pandemic has worsened the situation of human trafficking in the region and globally. Preliminary data show, for example, that the number of victims in the first 4 months of the pandemic alone was already 20% higher than the entire year of 2019. This trend unfortunately continued in the years that followed. Women and children, as well as refugees and migrants, are among the most vulnerable. For example, we established that there's an increase in the number of victims for sexual exploitation coming from Haiti, in Brazil and Chile, and more smuggling flows coming out of Venezuela. Elements of this vulnerability include long and dangerous migratory routes, lack of travel documents, limited economic resources, family separation due to displacement, and of course, the most often and urgent need to have essential goods and services such as healthcare and even food. Even though there are many trafficking routes in the Americas, the northbound route to Canada and the United States and the multi-destination route to the south of the continent appear to be the main trends within the region. The Darien Gap in Central America remains a particularly dangerous transit point due to the large number of migrants trying to cross it daily, the presence of organized crime, and the lack of resources to secure borders. Currently, UNODC is implementing 4 projects against trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants in Latin America and the Caribbean, benefiting 12 countries. In 2021, we supported the Dominican Republic and Bolivia to amend the national anti-trafficking laws. Recently, we received a request from Costa Rica to develop a new law against the smuggling of migrants. We are currently conducting research to determine the prevalence of forced labor in the gold mining sector in the state of Pará in Brazil that would hopefully inform future intervention to reduce this form of trafficking. We will also be supporting the government of the Honduras to assess their needs in addressing trafficking in persons. Through our expert advisors placed in many countries in the region and also in Costa Rica and Peru, we have been mentoring police and justice officials and facilitated trans-regional cooperation. With our support, last year, police and prosecutors from Costa Rica and Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka and Colombia, and from Sri Lanka again and the Dominican Republic met to exchange information on concrete cases and to advance operational cooperation. UNODC has also been a long-standing partner of RedTram, the Ibero-American network of specialized prosecutors on trafficking and smuggling. Together with RedTram, we have supported a series of Interpol live police operations in the region that resulted in the arrest of smugglers and the saving of many human trafficking victims. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the best of our efforts, human trafficking and organized crime remain a grave concern and a serious threat to human security. We need to do more. UNODC, with the support of IDB, will seek to improve the effectiveness of anti-trafficking responses in Latin America. Working closely with IDB, as well as with governments in the region, civil society, and the private sector, we can finally accomplish our goal for safer and fairer societies with dignity and justice for all. Thank you very much for your attention. I want to wish you a very successful meeting. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ilias. Con eso damos
Thank you,
finalización.
Ilias. That concludes the opening segment. It is such a pleasure to tell you that we have more than 100 people following us online, and we have you here in the room as well. We have the privilege of your presence. For those who are participating, please be reminded that if you want to post online, use the hashtag de Trata de Personas. I would like to introduce Natalie Alvarado from the Division on Innovation Division to serve citizens at IDB, and she will be moderating the panel Strengthening of States State Capacity Ability to Prevent and Respond to Trafficking in Persons. We will be hearing about the work to be done by the police corps, by the prosecutor's office, and also agencies in charge of fighting human trafficking. Welcome, Natalia. Good morning, everyone. We are going to start with our panel discussion. And this is it's such a privilege for me to be able to moderate this panel discussion. We have representatives from several countries, from the region, from the United States, and this will be a very interesting debate, I'm sure. I'd like to invite our panelists to join us up on the stage. Maria Alejandra Mangano, co-head prosecutor at the prosecutor's office for trafficking in persons, Protex at the federal prosecutor's office in Argentina. Welcome, ma'am. We have Sandra Paola Hitcher Angulo. She is the provincial prosecutor at the specialized prosecutor's office for trafficking in persons in Loreto, at the public prosecutor's office of Peru. Welcome. Also joining us online is Luis Mayandia Fernandez, Chief Commissioner, the Central Unit of of the National Police of Spain. So the Central Unit of Illegal Immigration Networks and False Documents, that is, and Kimoy Thomas Williams, Deputy Director, Counter Trafficking Unit, Ministry of National Security in Trinidad and Tobago. Good morning to all. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us today. The idea behind this first panel discussion is to hear about the work being done by the agencies that you represent. And one thing that came up once and again this morning during the opening ceremony is the need for an interinstitutional and cooperation-based approach. We also have Ms. Colleen Phillips. She's trial attorney at our Civil Rights Division with the Department of Justice, United States, and I apologize for that omission. We will get started right away with Ms. Phillips.
We know that the human trafficking prosecution unit has been in place for more than 15 years, I guess, no? So please tell us about a little bit the work that you're doing at the unit, and specifically the aspects of coordination between the federal, state, and the local level, between the enforcement authorities, the government agencies, as well as NGOs, victim service providers. Thank you.
Of course, thank you for having us. We appreciate the invitation. So the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit in the Department of Justice was created in 2007, so it's about 15 years old now. And it was created specifically to place subject matter experts on human trafficking in one office of the Department of Justice to lead the federal government's anti-trafficking work. We really approach combating human trafficking with three different streams. One is enforcing federal anti-trafficking laws. So we prosecute the cases of traffickers in the United States or where there's trafficking with a nexus to the United States. And we have a group of trial attorneys who do that. We work closely with our federal, state, and local law enforcement partners, as well as service providers who ensure that we can support and stabilize the victims. But just as important as prosecution, we also do a substantial amount of training, both nationally in the United States and internationally, because we recognize that human trafficking has no borders, and it requires a coordinated approach to combat trafficking among not only law enforcement officers and service providers in the United States, but across the world, if we're going to address and reduce trafficking worldwide. We hold over 50 training events every year. We reach over 6,000 people. And that is to ensure that we have one voice and one approach in how we combat human trafficking. And our third stream is through initiatives. So focused areas of combating trafficking. So we created what was called the ACT teams, or coordinated teams, anti-trafficking coordinated teams initiative. That was an initiative that only focused on federal prosecutors and law enforcement working together, but we also created the United States and Mexico bilateral anti-trafficking initiative, which is a very strong and important collaboration between the US government and Mexican government for addressing anti-trafficking. So we as a unit focus on these three streams to coordinate anti-trafficking efforts in the United States with our colleagues across the world.
Thank you very much. So training, collaboration, specialization between the borders. So this is part of the recipe. Ahora quisiera pasar a la fiscal Mangano.
Now I'd like to move to Prosecutor Mangano. Could you please tell us about the evolution of your institutional framework in Argentina, especially when it comes to specializing in human trafficking in the Office of the Public Prosecutor? That's one of the issues that has been of great interest to us. And could you please connect that to what was brought up by our UN colleague about the Ibero-American network of specialized prosecutors, RETRAM? Thank you. In Argentina, we also have a specialized unit specializing in human trafficking, and it was set up in 2008. Since then, we've been working with our headquarters in Buenos Aires with the help of all of our prosecutors in the country. We have 16 federal jurisdictions throughout the country, and Protex, our office, works in support of investigation, so evidence gathering, and also during oral trials where we support trial lawyers, trial attorneys in the DA's office. We also have one special challenge, which is that the low reporting rate. There's a great deal of underreporting. Victims fail to report. It's in Argentina, we're talking about less than 10% of cases that are reported by victims. That is why we need to have a specialized prosecutor's office that works with detection and identification of cases. And that creates a more complex type of approach to the phenomenon, which requires involvement of other civil servants. And sometimes there is collusion by large corporations or companies. And that is why we need to take a cooperative approach when it comes to detecting such cases. As to the Ibero-American network of prosecutors, which has been in place for several years, it was set up in 2011 and was built up in 2015 and 2017. Specifically with the help from UNODC, and has enhanced what we think is the most important part of this equation, which is specialized knowledge for all of these special prosecutors specializing in human trafficking. And that's knowledge. We work through informal and spontaneous cooperation in cross-border investigations, many of which involve two countries that share a border. But we also have multi-country cooperation, instances of multi-country cooperation, which we believe have led to better quality investigations by point-to-point investigation, or rather end-to-end investigation. And we have a secure platform to exchange information for our investigations. And we also use WhatsApp quite often, which is a very a handy way to communicate and find out about cases. And this is fundamentally important because victims don't usually, they can't wait. What we do mostly is ensure secure repatriation of victims who want to go back to their countries of origin or to a third secure country through the cooperation of the prosecutor's office. Could we say then, would it be fair to say that these specialized prosecutor's office have sped up and the process and made them more effective, especially where several countries are involved? Yes, of course. As my colleague from the United States was saying, the specialized prosecutor's office approach is vital, because the victim-centered approach requires coordination with agencies that are outside of the purview of the prosecutor's office, such as victims assistance, job placement, and others. And all of this type of coordination work, it will be more effective if you work with specialized prosecutors. Thank you, Madam Prosecutor, and we will go back to this victim-centered approach and later today. Welcome, Ms. Hitcher. I am very interested in finding out how you work within a prosecutor's office that is right on the border in a very in the forest, in very complex and challenging conditions. How do you work there? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Loreto is in the Amazonian, in the Peruvian Amazon. We have a triple border here with Colombia and Brazil. We border Colombia and Brazil, and we also share a border with Ecuador. And that is not all. Actually, we also have indigenous communities and native peoples in the area. The situation that we work in is one where it's difficult to reach certain areas where human trafficking occurs, but our efforts go hand in hand with our cooperation with the police and other government agencies. There is no dedicated budget for us to fight human trafficking, but we do have a national policy for 2030 for all of the agencies to work together in prosecution, in victim of criminals, and also victim protection and assistance. And in that way, we can reach these areas through our operations. When we do have an operation, we use several strategies. We have preventative operations meant to detect these instances of human trafficking early on. We travel to these places where migrants are recruited, or through which victims have to go up until the time when they reach the place where they're exploited, sometimes by boat. And we get help from the Navy. They provide us with vessels, but there's another issue, which is fuel. They don't have the fuel, and that's where regional governments come in, and they provide fuel to us. Fortunately, in Loreto, there is a regional task force against human trafficking that works together with all other government agencies involved on different fronts. We work on prevention, but also with the National Superintendency on Labor oversight and inspection to detect cases of forced labor. But we know that reality is even more dire, because there are other crimes that take place and that are linked to human trafficking in the area, such as sexual exploitation of Colombian, and Brazilian girls who come into Peru and end up being sexually exploited, or under false pretenses they are taken to the fields to be to work in the kitchens, and they end up being exploited. And we also have illegal logging and mining, which are two other activities that make the situation even more difficult and the situation even more serious. So what we try to create is a culture for people to feel comfortable reporting, so that they know the population is aware of what is happening in the area, and of what they should be aware and what they should be on the lookout for, but also who to contact so that we can intervene. And thanks to this, we have been able to detect several cases and have made the population aware of these cases, even if they're not the victims. But if they find out about somebody who's being the victim of this type of crime, that they report it. And that has led to coordination amongst institutions or agencies. If the crime occurs on the border, for example, as was the case with my colleague who just spoke, we have a WhatsApp group, and we have a group, a coordination group, for a cross-border coordination group for all three countries to work together and send out a warning, and we all look for the victims together. When it comes to victims belonging to indigenous communities, we have yet another barrier: language. So how do we reach out to these populations? We have created 2 apps in their mother tongues, so that they understand the implications of these crimes. And this has helped us improve the figures in terms of reporting. But criminals threaten the victims and their family members in the area. So the Office of the Public Prosecutor interviews family members. We take a comprehensive approach in working with families, not only victims, but also their families. We also work with an approach based and centered, victim-centered and trauma-centered approach. And we also protect victims' identities and witnesses' identities, thus reassuring victims and witnesses when they make a report. And so we can have our operations where we discover a crime and we are able to prosecute successfully. Thank you. I wonder whether Loreto is an exception, or whether in areas with similar situations, this is already the norm, because it's difficult for the state to reach all of these areas. So the question is Loreto just one of a kind experience, or are we seeing this replicated in the region or just in Peru? In Peru, we have Madre de Dios, La Pampa, which are remote areas, difficult to access areas where the main economic activity is illegal mining, where they get victims from Cusco, from Puno, from Loreto, under false job offers, and they end up being sexually exploited. In Puno, we also have a place called La Rinconada, an area where victims get taken to, and they are under such control that they cannot leave the area. They are not familiar with the area. They are being threatened by their captors, and there are prosecutors' offices in Loreto, Cusco, and Madre de Dios, and Puno working and simultaneously in coordination, and we launch operations together. We have a program called Sácalos de la Calle, Get Them Off the Street, or the routes of trafficking, where all of our prosecutors' offices, our specialized prosecutors' offices, 13 of them, work in coordination, because we are a place of origin, transit, and destination. And so we launched these operations in coordination at the same time, on the same day, and rescue victims and also make arrests. Thank you. We will now hear from Commissioner Luis Mayandia from Spain. And I'd like to hear about the importance and the unit that works with illegal migration and human trafficking. How do you work together with other stakeholders, you at the National Police Force? Good afternoon from Madrid and Spain. Greetings to all, warm greetings to all of you who are joining us online and on site. It's such an honor and such a wonderful opportunity for us to bring to the table all of the problems that we're faced with. And based on what I've heard so far, we share the same problems. For over 20 years, or rather 20 years ago, in Spain, it was decided to try and detect cases of slavery, which is now known as 21st century slavery, which is human trafficking for sexual labor exploitation, organ traffic, pornography, etc. And especially in Spain. And it was decided that a special prosecutor's office should be, or rather a special office should be created within the National Police Force, the immigration services, and because most of these persons were foreign women, and I'm saying women because that's where the gender of most of our victims, and although there are also men and underage women. The unit is the one that I'm honored to lead, although it's about irregular immigration or illegal immigration. This includes human trafficking, because there are mafias and there are organized crime organizations that do this. And that's why we decided to house it within that unit. So from the beginning, we started from scratch, because this is something that we didn't even have in our criminal law. This type of gratuitous violence or mistreatment or forced prostitution and against a woman's will, that is. And so this crime was described as what we now know as human trafficking. We are working and together, and I'm glad to know that we're all in sync with the rest of our colleagues. And side by side, this very morning, I met with the Special Prosecutor's Office for Immigration that is in charge of fighting human trafficking, which has offices in all provinces in Spain, where we have police corps that work against this type of crime. They're all part of the national police, and we also have special prosecutors.
Perdón, sí, no sé, no sé, he tenido alguna, bueno, se metió la traducción en inglés. Bien.
With whom we've been working. Very well, then, I was saying that we work bilaterally, but we also work directly. We are the judiciary police. We're working under the orders and the instructions that both the judges and the courts and the special prosecutor's office, in this case, establish. So we express the problems that we have when we have certain areas that allow us to understand these cases. The prosecutor's office has also participated in obtaining information and the need to collaborate. So I will mention something that we decided to get going, which has been very, very useful. In other words, the use, and this in the good sense, I would rather say the collaboration of the entire public, which is very much against all of these activities. We have an 800 line, a free line, which is available 24 hours for those people who are able to provide information without necessarily identifying themselves. Simply, this is information that they provide, which we then prove, and an email address, which is a trafficking at police forces. So this is something that is used by many kind people who report to us, to the prosecutor's office and the police forces, possible acts of violence against women. And then with an initial investigation, we can determine if we're talking about the trafficking of human beings or not. We've been working for quite some time. We are quite experienced. We also have a relationship with most of our countries, our friends. We have an exchange of information, which is permanent. And I'd like to qualify it somehow. I would say that this is a strategic type of information. After and the information, this becomes operative, and we share all this in order to make sure that we are working together. So I believe that this has provided very good results. We also do believe that, as an interesting fact, not always do victims know that they are victims. I would like to describe a very interesting case of young girls. I have to start by saying that in Spain, sexual practices for money are not illegal. Any person can have sexual practices in exchange of money, provided this is done voluntarily and without any coercion. We have detected usually younger women who come from different areas of the world, taking advantage of the open borders in the European Union. They can stay up to 90, 180 days in our territory in order to practice sex in exchange for money. But what these people, these young women, don't know is that behind them, there is a network that is taking the money from their clients. They're not aware of this. They also provide them with food and lodging. This is the exchange of information that we have with the other countries in this region. There are other cases, as in the case of the Ukraine war, with the kind heart that we all have. We've tried to assist many women who arrived here with families that were destroyed by the war and who are lodged in a very altruistic manner by Spaniards, taking advantage of the fact that they were helping in the household chores, and knowing that that work was determined by their assistants and others that perhaps saw this in a disinterested manner, an interested manner, they tried to figure out if this was work exploitation. And this is something that has been mentioned by the prosecutor's office in Argentina and other colleagues, but this is the origin of things, and this is how we have conducted this activity in Spain. Thank you, um, Chief Mayandia. I would ask the panelists if they could tell us about prevention. How are you stopping all this? What is prevention in terms of the work that you're doing to avoid falling within these traffic networks? I think that this is an important part of these comprehensive strategies.
Tobago, Mrs. Williams, welcome to the event. Can you please explain to us what the role and function of the counter trafficking unit is, and also we would like to hear also what are the what the stakeholders or the main stakeholders are working and coordinating together.
Okay, hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here this morning. The Counter Trafficking Unit is a branch of the Ministry of National Security. So whereas in other countries, you'd see the anti-trafficking units being primarily police agencies, we are a hybrid unit. So we are made up of both police officers as well as civilian staff. It was established under the Trafficking in Persons Act. So we are a statutory body as well. Now, the police officers, they are the ones who deal with, like, for example, intelligence. So sometimes we would get reports from members of the public or from other agencies saying that there may be human trafficking taking place in a particular part of the country. And the police officers, they would go out and do intel exercises. So they would observe the places. Sometimes they go into the bars, you know, speak with persons so as to gather information. And then they come back, and based on what they observe, they would determine if a rescue operation is needed. In that case, they would then reach out to other police officers in other branches. These would be the operational units, so that they could go out to rescue persons if they need to be rescued. The police officers, of course, would also be responsible for arresting and charging perpetrators of trafficking, and they also take statements from victims. Now, these officers attached to the unit, they are specially trained because, you know, human trafficking is a very heinous crime, and the victims would have undergone a number of traumatic experiences. So the officers receive ongoing training on how to treat with victims. So, for example, if we have victims who are very timid or, you know, they might be afraid, we always ensure that we have victim support officers present when the officers are engaging with them. These victim support officers would more or less be there to sympathize with them, touch them if they need a pat on the back, make sure that they're okay, you know, just to give them that extra strength and support when they are sharing their story. We also have the victim support officers available when we are dealing with child victims, because a number of our victims are very young. They come from as young as 15 years, 16, 17 years. So we provide that as well. On the civilian side now, apart from the admin, you know, all units have admin stuff to do. So we do that. But apart from that, we also ensure that the victims get the care that they need, because victims, just like us, they need food, they need clothing, they need shelter. So these are the things that we do. We have to build relationships with NGOs. They are one of our major partners because they are the ones who would provide the victims with grocery vouchers, shelter, sometimes clothing. Another thing that the civilian staff does at the CTU is public awareness, because what we realized with COVID is that a lot of the traffickers, they moved online. So they were recruiting a lot of these young women, especially from Venezuela, through Facebook and WhatsApp. So when we reach out to the migrant community now, we always advise them that when persons reach out to you promising you jobs, unless it's you have a way to verify it, you should be slow in coming, because sometimes they send pictures, you know, of these fancy places where they're going to work, and then when they come here, they realize it's not the case. So we do that. We right now we are sensitizing frontline workers. So these are persons who work in immigration, Coast Guard, because these officers also encounter illegal migrants early. So based on the training that they get, they could determine if these are victims of trafficking. Our young persons are also at risk because, once again, most persons are doing things online. They're always online with their games, you know, the TikTok videos, Instagram, all their online games. So we also reach out to a number of schools. We do it both in person as well as virtual. So we bring awareness to them as well to help to protect them. So that is what we really do at the unit. It's ongoing, and some of our major stakeholders would of course be immigration, because our victims need legal documentation to remain in the country for the duration of their investigation. So the immigration unit, they would provide them with legal documents to allow them to stay in the country. We also work closely with Children's Authority, which falls under the Office of the Prime Minister, because again, for our victims that are children, we put them in children's homes. So that is where Children's Authority comes into play. And we've also seen a rise in labor exploitation in Trinidad. So we work very closely with Ministry of Labor. So they would go into the workplaces. These are like the restaurants, factories, hotels to ensure that persons are being paid properly. They are not being exploited. They are not being forced to work for very long hours without any bathroom breaks. So we work closely with them as well. And of course, the NGOs, we have to work closely with them because they are the ones who really assist us with victim care. Who else do we work with? We work with the various police agencies because again, human trafficking is offense. So we need the police support and of course the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions because they are the officers that would take these matters to court. So we ensure that they get training as well because what we found is that a number of the lawyers, they were treating human trafficking as a normal criminal offense. But because of the training that they've been receiving, we are seeing more and more matters reaching before the courts, well, at least at the magistrate's level, and eventually the hope is to get it before the High Court. So that is what we do really in the counter-trafficking unit.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I think it was very enlightening what you mentioned in terms of focus on the victim and from there coordinate everything that is needed to really respond in an efficient way. Thank you very much for that. Vamos a pasar a una segunda ronda de preguntas.
Now we'll go to another second round of questions. I'm going to start with Ms. Mangano. I'd like to know, can you tell us what the importance of these specialized units are? I would like us to focus on the victim. We have to concentrate on the victim as the object of our intervention in every single sense. So the specialization of these units with this focus, could you please describe the work and how do you address those common crimes that also have the trafficking issue as a background? I would say that the focus centered on the victim as an investigative method is one of the issues that should be at the fore in terms of prosecutions. When we think about specialized prosecutors, for instance, when we're talking about drug trafficking, undoubtedly, there are aspects that have to do with detection, the routes that are taken, and this is also something that the prosecutors should be aware of. When we talk about prosecutors that specialize in human trafficking, they have to be people who understand the trauma, the consequences, because this is a very serious violation of human rights, and what it generates in human beings. So they have to be sensitized and creative in order to understand the central issue, which is coercion. It's very difficult to understand what coercion is in a certain case without having the necessary empathy to put oneself in that person's place. Many times these people are indeed migrants, but being a migrant has to do with vulnerability, which is a central issue in trafficking, which is the other face of coercion. If you can detect that situation of being vulnerable, if you can describe it and understand it, then you'll be able to go in and understand and analyze the coercion that was exerted by the traffickers on that victim. If we're talking about a woman who has minors, who supports these minors, or if we're talking about a young child, a migrant who doesn't understand the language, who's illiterate. If you can detect these issues, vulnerability in particular, then it'll be easier to understand coercion. What we've seen throughout these years that we've been working in our region and all of our countries, this is a rather new crime. It has been prosecuted thanks to the Palermo Protocol, and this is something novel. Over the years, we've realized that the specialized prosecutors can understand the dynamic of the crime itself and therefore understand the cases more specifically. At the same time, aside from the judiciary, the definition of coercion and the criminal framework, then what we have to understand is that if this does not include an immediate assistance for these victims, then there's really no sense in investigating this crime. If we can't provide these victims the ability to recover, if we can't provide them with a shelter, with food and clothing, especially if we're talking about these people that have no hygiene, that live in these conditions, we are leaving them in even worse conditions. So I believe that the work that has to be done has to be to assist, and it's a very important topic. It's a very complex one. We need to make sure that they are fully aware of all of the underpinnings and have contact with all of the other prosecutors' offices that are in the other countries, the neighboring countries. And this, of course, will help them to go to trial so that they can prepare their case, because many times the victim doesn't see herself or himself as a victim that is accompanied, that has someone with them, could arrive at a trial understanding what happened to them when they were being exploited. Thank you so very much. I think that you have described in words how complex it is to tackle this type of crime.
Especially regarding this victim center approach. What are the special provisions and also protection services that the Department of Justice has, especially to protect foreigners identified in the United States? And specifically, if you can refer to the case of victims from Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to make clear that the United States does not differentiate the rights and services given to victims based on the country they're from or their national origin. So just because someone is a foreign victim, they don't get treated differently than if they're a victim who was born in the United States. The important part is that you've been a victim of crime. And as my colleague has stated, we recognize that you're a victim of crime because you had a vulnerability. And we need to reduce that vulnerability. We need to make sure that why someone was able to exploit you and traffic you, whether it was because of poverty or they manipulated your children or some other reason, is reduced through supports and services. And so we don't differentiate what's given to victims based on something like foreign status or domestic. That said, we also realize that taking advantage of a foreign citizen victim might be the means of the trafficker to coerce, right? And we have to worry about aspects with foreign-born victims that you may not have to with domestic victims. They might be English language learners who don't understand the rights that they have in the United States. The traffickers may take away their legal documents to be in the United States and they're scared to leave. There may be threats of the legal system used against them. I'll have you deported, right? Even though that isn't true, with a lack of understanding of American law, the victim might believe it's true. So there are specific protections that are provided by the United States. And these are provided by the Department of Homeland Security, who I know my colleague in Peru works with, including continued presence. So if you've been identified as a victim of trafficking, you can get a special protected status that says you can stay in the United States, no one can deport you, no one can make you leave while the case is ongoing. We also have visas to protect foreign victims so that if they choose, they can stay in the United States during and even after the prosecution investigation of their case. But trauma-informed, and my colleague over in Argentina said this, trauma-informed means letting the victim decide what they want. Maybe they want to repatriate. Maybe they want to go back home. Maybe they want to stay. We don't force a victim to stay in the United States during an investigation and prosecution. What we focus on is creating a relationship of trust so that we can contact them when they go back and continue to try to build that case. But it's very important that we recognize that victims have had control of their lives taken away, and being victim-centered is allowing them to have control back. Tell us if you want to stay here. Tell us what are the supports and services you need. And as I leave this, I just want to say, and I was listening to my colleague in Trinidad Tobago, DOJ, the Department of Justice, but also many of our federal partners support and fund victim service providers, because we do need to stabilize the victims. We do need to make sure they have the supports necessary. And it's not enough to just rely on our partners in the NGO community. We also provide them financial support, technical assistance, guidance, and best practices, because it's a cooperative fight here. We're all in it together.
Thank you, Mrs. Phillips. I think one great lesson is to take into account the different vulnerabilities, and especially when it's, the vulnerability of being migrant, not being able to speak the language or not having documents. That part is the vulnerability we have to take into account. Thank you for that. Mrs. Thomas, in the case, in the context of your country, who are the primary victims and how are they recruited? And also, if you can give us in general terms, how the country, or especially the unit, deal with this victim-centered approach, if you can expand a little bit in that.
Okay, right. So the majority of our victims come from Venezuela, and they are between the ages of 14 to 32 years. Most of them have children back in Venezuela. So what they tell us is that they really came to Trinidad to work to get money to send back to their relatives. They are recruited online. It has been like that for the past 3 years, more or less, where either strangers would reach out to them through Facebook or WhatsApp, promising them jobs. Their relatives sometimes reach out to them as well, because we've had cases where some of our girls came in through a cousin, sometimes a sister, telling them to come and work. Some of them also would have said that they knew they were coming to do prostitution. However, when they came, they found themselves not being able to move around freely. They were not being paid. So for example, if they did a service, they would not receive any money for it. And if they refused or tried to escape, their traffickers would either beat them, force them to take drugs, or threaten their relatives, because the traffickers seem to be very well informed as to who these girls' relatives are, and also where they live. So they actually take pictures of their relatives and show it to them to instill fear in them. Within the past year, we've seen some male Venezuelans also becoming victims of trafficking, but this is labor exploitation. Many of them, they come to Trinidad illegally with their relatives, usually a wife and 2 or 3 children, and then they go out looking for jobs. They tend to get jobs in the agricultural sector, so that is where they are planting crops. However, they are not being paid. They are being forced to work very long hours. So those are the 2 main types of victims that we have. Of course, we have other labor victims from countries such as Haiti and India, but that is a very small percentage in comparison to the Venezuelan victims that we have. With regard to the victim-centered approach, we try to help the victims, primarily Venezuelans, to feel very comfortable here. So what we do is we expose them immediately to social assessments. So that is where social workers have interviews with them so as to determine what their immediate needs are. So for example, many of them need ongoing medical treatment. So some of the females would have STIs, so we ensure that they get their medical attention. A lot of them need counseling as well. So again, we provide counseling for both our child victims as well as adult victims. We also expose them to English because a number of them say that they wish to remain in Trinidad, at least for the duration of the investigation of their cases. So we expose them to English, and it's really amazing to see that 95% of our child victims within a period of 1 to 2 months, they are speaking English very well, because, you know, they say children take up languages very quickly, but it's amazing to see how well they learn it. And I think another thing that works in this favor is, apart from the English classes, they are also mixing with Trinidadian children their age. So the language is very good. They're picking it up really quickly. And we also expose the adults to classes where they could become self-sufficient, because our motto here at the unit is not just to rescue persons or save persons, but also to empower them. So we expose them to courses where they express interest. We have a number of them interested in doing makeup classes, hairdressing classes, chef courses, party planning. We expose them to those things, and then they get certificates after. The victim care officer at the unit also assists them with job preparation, because again, we want them to become independent. So we help them to do their resumes. We show them videos on how to take an interview. We drop off job applications for them, and a number of them do end up getting fairly good jobs here to work, so that they become very self-sufficient. They no longer require assistance as far as accommodation is concerned. You know, they pay their own rent. And it's very good to see the transition from when we first get them to how they are afterwards. With regard to the minors, we try to show them Trinidad and Tobago. So we partner with the Defense Force, and we take them out on field outings to historical parts of the country so that they're aware of it. They also have culture shows at the homes for them. So whereas the Trinidadian girls could show the culture of Trinidad, like carnival, the different foods, etc., the Venezuelan girls in turn show their culture. They take part in activities. So it's very all-inclusive. So that is some of the things that we do to ensure that, you know, we take care of them, and our approach is very victim-centered.
Thank you, Mrs. Thomas. Something that really struck me in the intervention is the last years we have seen it, how the digitalization had helped a lot of resolve a lot of problems, but also we see how also crime become more active and efficient in terms of attracting victims through the platforms, and also we have to find solutions also to contract this kind of evolutions. Thank you. Comisario Mayandía, usted nos mencionaba los mecanismos de cooperación.
Chief Mayandía, you were talking about the international cooperation initiatives. Can you tell us a little bit more about victims and their families when they find themselves in this very complex international scenario?
Perdón, la pregunta iba para mí, es que no he podido oír el principio.
Was the question for me? I wasn't able to listen to the beginning of your question. You mentioned the activities that you perform internationally, your national police and your unit in particular. Could you please provide us greater detail and provide more examples of the cooperation that you have had with a number of other countries?
First of all, I would like to say something that because maybe I didn't explain myself properly. In Spain, victims, as in other places in the world, are victims. They don't have a nationality. We don't care about their nationality. It's not important. In fact, if these crimes are investigated by the units, the police specialized in foreign affairs, is because of the support that we provide victims with. In other words, we work, as it's been said before, with NGOs that are specialized in human trafficking, with the prosecutor's office. And from the moment that the person is identified as a victim, what we do is to enforce the Spanish legislation in order to support them. If they're a foreigner and they're in Spain, undocumented, the administrative process about its potential removal and repatriation is automatically frozen and filed while the main issue is resolved, which is freeing the victim that we're working with and the investigation that will allow us to arrest the human traffickers that may have been involved in the entire operation. And that is, I just wanted to clarify this point. Now, regarding cooperation mechanisms, 4 or 5 days ago, I was in Romania, and there we have initiated a campaign against human trafficking. The slogan is very much an advertising type slogan, but it really touches the heart of those that we need to help and of those from which we need help in order to combat this type of scourge. And basically, it's about fighting against human trafficking. We've implemented in Romania, and it addresses the badly named client, the user of prostitution services, where victims are involved. We would like to penalize the activity, the demand of sex in exchange of money. I'm not justifying the demand in any case, but even less so when it's done under coercion and threats to a person. Our investigation, our actions target victims. I've also been to Colombia, Brazil. We have bilateral partnerships. I can say that we have a specific collaboration in Colombia. We detected a victim. The problem was the following. In Spain, we could maybe guarantee the well-being of the victim because right away the victim becomes part of a witness program where she or he is protected. They are basically supported by an NGO in order to meet all their basic needs. But many times the threat comes from their country of origin. And that's where when we have a problem, thanks to the bilateral relationships that we have, we normally get in touch with our counterparts within the police in the other country, and we inform them of the threat that the victim is suffering from. So recently we detected a criminal group in Colombia. They were threatening two victims that we had freed in Spain. And thanks to immediate collaboration with Colombia, in less than 48 hours, the husband and the children of these victims were identified and were moved to Spain. The Spanish government paid for their traveling costs, and that way we addressed the threat of those victims. Today, we collaborate with specialized organizations, and those women are redoing their lives. That is the type of cooperation that we need, not only in terms of the investigation and the strategy about exchanging strategic information that then becomes operational. That's not the end of it. We need much more. We need to know that our colleagues are also the same as us, are willing to help victims directly, protecting them and also arresting those involved in criminal organizations in the country of origin. So that is done thanks to bilateral collaboration between countries. But the more people we have involved in this type of collaboration, the easier it will be to fight against these criminal organizations. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I believe that the Spanish National Police also carries out international efforts in terms of prevention of human trafficking, advertising campaigns or awareness campaigns rather. Could you talk a little bit more about the one that you mentioned, Con la trata no hay trato? Yes, this is an informational or an awareness campaign. And this takes me to something that Trinidad and Tobago said. Children absorb everything, information, learnings, languages. So we want to target the youngest ones. We want to educate them about how important it is to show solidarity, to collaborate. We want to raise awareness among everyone so that when someone demands sex, and they want to pay for sex, they are actually putting other people at risk. People that could be aware of being victims, or maybe not. Maybe they're in a situation that is risky and that makes them especially vulnerable. They could potentially be victims to those vultures, those vampires that take advantage of the situation. The situation is very delicate, and it's a matter of saying that a person deserves respect and deserves to be seen as as a human being, because many times those victims are left without anything because they've been stripped from absolutely everything by their exploiters. So we would I think this effort demands collaboration by all stakeholders. Usually, the victims are allured by someone that tells them that they're going to pay them a lot of money, they're going to offer them the world. So we have to tell them to be careful with those jobs that they're promised in exchange of a lot of money. Careful with biting the bait. In order to prevent that from happening, we have to raise awareness about the countries in the countries of origin, in the countries of transit, and also in countries such as Spain, where we receive all these people because we have a demand for sex in exchange of money. We have two protocols. The one to provide assistance that are victims of human trafficking, and those are migrants, and those are victims of smuggling. Within this protocol, we have different guidelines, and we can support the victims of human trafficking, focusing on children and adolescents. And it also talks about the institutions that we could work with in order to support the victims. The public ministry also has another protocol in place, and this one has to do with addressing the vulnerability of the victims. Within this protocol, we have 4 different areas of expertise, and thanks to those, we could establish the needs of the victims themselves, of those children or adolescents, but also in order for this to be part of the investigation. This is not really necessary for minors and their vulnerable situation, but it reinforces the case when we present the case before the prosecutor's office. This vulnerability protocol, like I said, includes 4 areas of expertise: the anthropological one, the psychological one, then there's a medical one, and a psychiatric one. These are the bases that we use in order to be able to work and document everything. We also have a unit to protect and assist victims of human trafficking. This is one of our centers within the prosecutor's office. When there's an operation, the victims unit goes to the victim. We have a lawyer, a psychologist, and a social worker that is part of this unit. They're part of this unit. And this victims and witnesses unit is the one that provides assistance to the prosecutor. They establish the primary or basic needs of the victim. During the investigation, this unit will also assist the victim. In the case of children and adolescents, the victims and witnesses unit is the one who establishes through different reports how we could actually collaborate in order to do the following. First, to make sure that we don't re-victimize the minor. Maybe when with a with an interview with a Hessel camera, make sure that there's only one uniform statement throughout the entire investigation. Before any type of due diligence, what we actually prioritize is the emotional well-being of our victims, regardless of whether they're minors or not. We also verify if the victim needs to be reintegrated into school. We then work with the victims unit to make sure that the kid can go back to school. We try to see if they have documents. In some cases, we've seen that the traffickers have gone to very remote areas in the Amazon region, and they've actually used forfeited birth certificate. And they've actually validated this fake birth certificate. They've issued a valid national ID, and they've changed, for example, the age of the victim. In those cases, we work with the entire team in order to see if the minor has been left by their family, their relatives or not. We also inform them about the government programs such as Beca 18, Pensión 65 for the parents. We also provide some economic incentives to the parents. We, as part of the public ministry, also try to help them find a job. We also try to help them when starting a business. We don't work with the children in this case, but obviously with the relatives of the children. So we work together with NGOs to make sure there's funding to help them when they start a business. We're talking here obviously about adult victims, victims of human trafficking that, for example, have a little shop where they sell groceries, where they have a beauty salon, and we try to provide them with training through specialized centers, and we also try to provide them with funding so that they can start their business. In addition to this, if the minor starts living in a shelter, the shelter is normally managed by a unit within the government, and we make sure that the minor is taken care of. The public ministry is in contact with the center, with this shelter, basically, in order to identify the needs of the minor and in order to make sure that there is a plan in place to reintegrate the minor, not only back into their families, but also into society. We try to see what the minor could actually do and what they need to do at that moment. Maybe they need to go back to school, maybe they need to work on their emotional well-being. Many of them have Stockholm syndrome and among other syndromes. And we also work on seeing victims as individuals with rights. We notify the Ministry of Justice right away to make sure that lawyer is assigned to their case in order to protect them, to ask for civil reparation. When we see that the traffickers actually have certain wealth and own properties, we actually make sure that we send the order to make sure that those assets are frozen. We're running out of time. On behalf of all the participants here today and on my behalf, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. This is one of many dialogues that we are holding. There are many questions that have been left unanswered, I'm afraid, but we're running out of time. It was a pleasure to moderate this panel. Now I would like to invite Minister Juan Ernesto Zapata, Minister of the Interior and Security of Ecuador, who will offer some closing remarks for this panel. Minister, welcome. Thank you very much. Greetings to everyone. Greetings from the Ministry of the Interior in Ecuador. Human trafficking is a crime that gravely affects the life of a person, not only in terms of their fundamental rights, but it attacks the integrity of the victims in Ecuador. We have identified the goals or the objectives for which these victims are kidnapped. That way, we have started identifying different cases. The most common objectives are sexual exploitation, recruitment of youth for different gangs at a national and international level. According to data registered since the pandemic, we need to respond more effectively. We've seen an increase in the murder rate from 7.8 to 18.9%. And we see that this rate is increasing. We've seen more than 9 violent incidents in the prisons in the country. Ecuador has become a country that is dealing with an increase in organized transnational crime. We see that 6 every 10 victims of human trafficking are women. We need to develop our work to get always with the gender approach in order to address this crime. In Ecuador, since 2021, we are trying to implement international cooperation in order to find strategic partners and have common agendas to face transnational organized crime. In 2019, we listened to different international recommendations for Ecuador and their fight against human trafficking. The government, therefore, implemented an action plan against human trafficking. This plan is from 2019 to 2030, and it addresses all forms of human trafficking under our criminal code, and it considers all different victims, national and international, with special approach on girls, adolescents, and women as especially vulnerable population. With civil society, with support of the government, we wanted to identify the different vulnerable groups, the different profiles of the victims, their sex, age, nationality, mode of exploitation, their economic conditions, area of residence, level of income, among others. The national government, through the public ministry, is right now designing an action plan against smuggling of migrants. This plan will have a very similar approach to the one that I just mentioned. We are the competent authority in terms of human trafficking and migrant smuggling, and we also chair the Interinstitutional Committee Against Human Trafficking, Migrant Smuggling, and Protection of Victims. It encompasses 3 agencies, government agencies, the Presidency of the country, the Secretary of Human Rights, the Foreign Affairs Minister, the part of the judiciary, and the General Attorney's Office, as well as the Ombudsman. Through this group of institutions, we coordinate public policy to address human trafficking and illegal migrant smuggling. In addition to this, and in order to strengthen the work with the different regional blocs, on the 2nd and 3rd of March of 2022, We signed different instruments with ministries of justice and interior in Latin America in order to develop the Latin American Committee of Security. My country will hold the third chairmanship after Argentina and another country. We identify three priorities areas: the fight against human trafficking, the fight against smuggling immigrants, the fight against trafficking in arms and environmental crimes. The Ministry of the Interior has been working on a strategic plan in order to address these crimes. There are 5 different pillars: prevention, assistance, protection, strengthening of international cooperation, and research and diagnosis. All these activities will allow us to assess the situation, develop public policies, adopt strategic plans in order to fight against human trafficking. Right now, we are celebrating I would like to celebrate the IDB's initiative of organizing events such as today's event in order to foster international cooperation in our region and for knowledge sharing about the fight against human trafficking. As a part of the Ecuadorian government, we would like to join efforts with the international community and organizations such as the IDB in order to mitigate and eradicate this type of crimes in our region. We would like to underscore that the objective of my government is to have a country free of human trafficking. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Minister Zapata. It's been a privilege to have you in this session. We normally keep the prizes for the end of the session, but today we're going to do it now. We would like to present the results of the contest Gobernarte by the IDB. The objective is to award and disseminate initiatives about good governance. In order to announce the winning governments, by the way, we would like to congratulate everyone, but I would like now to offer the floor to Roberto de Michele, who's chief of the Division on Innovation and Citizen Services of the IDB. Roberto, welcome. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining the audience the importance of these dialogues and how important it's been to overcome the restrictions imposed by the pandemic and to see each other in person, because it's very important for these dialogues. I would like to explain what this prize or award is about and why it's so important for us. The IDB is a development agency that bases its actions on evidence, but we don't know everything. A lot that we do, we learn it from you. And this award basically tries to capture the experience, the knowledge of our member states, and to acknowledge that. That's why this award wants to basically signal what are the good practices in terms of management, innovation, entrepreneurship, the use of digital technologies, transparency, responsibility, and accountability. These cross-cutting issues are critical in our region for all different sectors, but especially for citizen security, especially for today's dialogue. This contest has been celebrated in different occasions, and we've awarded more than 35 initiatives in our region. Behind each one of these initiatives, behind of each one of these awards, there is a very important jury that analyzes each one of the proposals. We have Mariana Ruenes, who is founder and director of the NGO Sintrata from Mexico, Jose Clax, international consultant, Uruguayan, specialized in digital technologies and the use of technology in order to improve public management. Lourdes Fernandez, a well-known Peruvian journalist and consultant of CS. She has developed her professional career precisely informing about human trafficking issues. And Marco Trolin, a specialist in citizen security and human rights, he chaired the commissions of the Legislative Assembly of Rio Grande do Sul, a state in Brazil that has really made big efforts in this regard. To all members of the jury, thank you very much. It's a very delicate type of work, but also very important given the amount of proposals that we have received. We have 3 initiatives that have been acknowledged under prevention category. I would like to say that there's no preference just because I'm Argentinian, because one of them is from Tucumán, a province in my own country. The other 2 are not Argentinian, and that sounds, apologies, that shows the objectivity of the jury. First of all, I would like to say that for the municipalities of less than 100,000 inhabitants, the program of intelligent or smart security to prevent human trafficking, the province of Tucumán was recognized. This initiative has focused on addressing different types of crime, including human trafficking, and working on prevention and focusing on the collaboration between the government and civil society. For municipalities of more than 1 million people, the winning is Medellin, Colombia. This initiative offers assistance to victims through innovative strategies based on knowledge management and immediate protection measures through urgent services and comprehensive assistance. Here we include mental, social, and legal assistance. And this was addressed during the panel that we just had. And finally, for municipalities of less than 1 million inhabitants, the winning initiative is prevention of human trafficking in Pereira, Colombia. Since 2015, this initiative has focused on actions, educational actions, where the youth between 10 and 20 years old become active stakeholders that get involved in advocacy efforts, raising awareness about this issue. This initiative was presented by the local government of Pereira and the municipal committee for the fight against human trafficking. Here, I would like to take a pause in order to say something very special about this year's award, Pablo Valente. It's in honor of a colleague that has been very inspiring. It has been a source of inspiration for all of us. He's a colleague that did precisely this during his professional career: innovation, transparency. He used the social media to promote his work. His spouse is here with us today, and we do this in memory of Pablo. So thank you to all the winners. I think that they are connected. As you know, we won't leave the contest here. We will have a ceremony in person. For logistical reasons, we couldn't bring the winners today, but congratulations to everyone, especially to my province in Argentina, Tucumán, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Roberto. Nos emocionamos mucho recordando.
Thank you, Roberto. It was very moving to hear you talk about our very dear colleague, Pablo. And to all of the award winners, congratulations. We're going to take a very short break now for all of you to please be back on time. And we have a survey, a satisfaction survey. We would like to hear your feedback, have your feedback. Please feel free to scan the QR code up on the screen, and it shouldn't take longer than 5 minutes to answer. And in the meantime, we'll break for coffee. If you're at home, go stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee, and there's coffee served outside. And we will meet back here at 12:15 local time for our second session. Thank you.
1, 2, 3. One, two, three.
Qué lindo. Bienvenidos y muchísimas gracias por la puntualidad. Los invitamos a tomar
Welcome
asiento.
back and thank you for being on time. Please go back to your seats so that we can get started with panel number 2. To our colleagues who are with us online, there is just so you know, we had very tasty refreshments for coffee and we got a bit distracted, but people are getting back.
Pasamos ahora al segundo panel del día de
We're now
hoy.
moving to the second panel for today, strategic partnerships with the private sector to fight trafficking in persons. Here, we're going to talk about different ways through which the private sector can contribute to the fight against trafficking. The moderator will be Isabel Verdeja, Gender Diversity and Inclusion Officer with the Advisory Services Division at IDB Invest. Welcome, Isabel. And we would like to invite the rest of our panel members to come up to the front of the room. And if you're joining us online, to turn on your camera. Thank you. Thank you, Adela. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this panel discussion on strategic alliances with the private sector to fight trafficking in persons. I would like to call on our panel members. We have Ms. Sandy Recinos, Executive Director of the Secretariat Against Sexual Violence, Exploitation, and Trafficking in Persons with the Guatemalan government. Kendra Gregson.
Apologies, Kendra is joining us virtually today. Kendra Gregson es asesora regional en protección de la infancia de UNICEF.
She is the regional advisor for child protection with UNICEF. Mariana Ruenes, director of Sintrata, Mexico. Serena Grant, head of business engagement with Walk Free Foundation, Australia. And Ambi Fan, Director for Global Government Affairs and Business Diplomacy with Walmart. Thank you all for agreeing to join us today. Several organizations and sectors will be represented in this discussion about the key role to be played by the private sector in fighting human trafficking globally, and especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, our region. I would like to ask you to please limit your participation to 2 or 3 minutes so that we can have a dynamic dialogue. Let's get started with our first round of questions. Let us start with Ms. Sandy Recinos from Guatemala. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Sandy, we are aware of the fact that the public sector does have public policy in place to fight and punish the crime of human trafficking, but to get the best results, we need for all stakeholders to contribute. Which strategies have been put in place by Guatemala to create and maintain partnerships with the private sector in this fight? Thank you, and good morning to all. First of all, I'd like to extend my thanks to the IDB for sponsoring these dialogues, whereby we, on behalf of our governments, can share good practices and learn from each other in the interest of fighting the scourge of human trafficking that denigrates human beings. And I'd like to extend my greetings to those here at the head table and also the regional network against human trafficking. Talking about efforts made to involve the various sectors in our country in fighting, in preventing and fighting human trafficking is a major endeavor. I mean, we have to cover all sectors in society, and it is very important for all of us to join in these efforts. And it's not just about the state and its agencies. And that is why we have public policy in place in Guatemala to fight human trafficking. And for the last 2 years, we've had an operational plan in place in response to what was happening as a consequence of the pandemic. Everything was changing. Traffickers were changing in their MOs and how they treated victims. So we had to update our own operational plan and our own work plan. And that's where we decided to start working with a land-based approach or a territorial-based approach and involving the private sector. That is how we first pinpointed the sectors of the economy where companies could be engaged in prevention efforts, and to identify where those companies were, who they were, and based on their coverage in terms of geography and also population, and areas that were close to borders or migrant routes where some might take advantage of these or some traffickers might take advantage of these companies to recruit victims. That is how we signed agreements and created partnerships to build capacity with the staff of these companies and train them. In Guatemala, one of the major challenges is the lack of awareness within the population when it comes to people or human trafficking. So certain behaviors have come to be seen as normal throughout history, and that includes human trafficking. That's one of the major challenges that we are faced with. So that was the second thing that we did with the private sector, and thus we were able to empower all of the upper management and middle management and all of the staff members and the employees through a communication campaign to raise awareness, not only within companies, but that they also become catalysts for that message with their family members and others. And in the hotspots for these crimes and also areas that were on the border, there were specific working groups that were created with specific sectors such as the hospitality industry, tourism industry, which were more vulnerable to actions by traffickers, also so that they were informed and aware of the most often seen modalities of human trafficking, but also for them to understand that because of their role in the economy, these sectors of private endeavors were more vulnerable. And we also worked with the Secretariat fighting sexual exploitation and also human trafficking. There's a group against exploitation of children and adolescents in tourism, and also we also have a working group to prevent exploitation through information technology tools, so as to reach those harder to reach communities, remote communities where there is not so much of a presence of the state and where the private sector can boost the work being done. And that's where we created networks for coordination involving local governments, government agencies, international organizations, and the private sector, so as to inform them of the situation and raise awareness about the situation and tell private companies that human trafficking is a reality and your companies might be used by traffickers or as part of the of your own just business, you might end up inadvertently violating human rights. And so that struck a chord with them and was very important. We were thus able to launch a strategy called traveling free from trafficking. And because one of the main issues in main stages in trafficking is also transporting people. And so we started working with the largest transportation company in Guatemala that moves about 15,000 users a year. And that also works with countries, bordering countries such as Honduras and El Salvador. So we trained their employees in charge of transportation, but also those working with ticket sales, etc., and to raise awareness about victims and social responsibility, to work on prevention and victim identification. And also, they asked us, how are we going to identify that find out that somebody's a victim? How can we tell that we are dealing with a victim? So we worked hard on that, and we had some success stories where some of the employees who were on these vehicles were able to identify victims and help them. They were in Mexico and they were sent to Guatemala with protection, and they later reported the crime in our country. Also, we have a code of conduct that was another part of our work with the private sector. This is given away by the National Tourism Board in Guatemala. And this code of conduct is also part of an agreement that is signed, and companies can get certified and accreditation for awareness raising about the problem in their companies.
It's a pleasure to have you as a guest on this panel. From your perspective, working at UNICEF, how can businesses impact children's rights? And specifically, why should the private sector engage in child trafficking prevention and protection?
Like the previous speaker, really, thank you very much for inviting UNICEF and myself to be part of this event and to be part of this distinguished panel, and to everyone who's here who are really interested in ending trafficking. Latin America is one of the most violent places to grow up. Different from other regions, violence starts young. By the age of 1, many children have experienced violent discipline. Soon thereafter, there is a high risk of sexual violence. And then as adolescents, where the adolescent homicide rate in the region is 4 times higher than the global average. And I mention these because a victim of trafficking may easily be a victim of these other sorts of violations. And it's not possible to end violence alone. We need to partner with everyone to make Latin America and the Caribbean a safe place for all. All children in one way or another are affected by business activity. They may be consumers of products and services, they're exposed to marketing and advertising, they're young workers, and as children as workers, and they're also users of business. In 2012, UNICEF, the United Nations Global Compact, and Save the Children developed the Children's Rights and Business Principles. And that was in consultation with business, with trade unions, with investors, with children, with civil society and human rights organizations. And it takes a practical approach to laying out the implications of the Convention on the Rights of the Child for the business world. When a child is violated, it impacts that child for life. It impacts them personally and also impacts their ability to learn and to be contributing members of society. The brain of a child who has witnessed violence, let alone experienced violence, doesn't grow the same as that of a child who has not experienced these or witnessed violence. So it says value to business also to end violence and end trafficking for their own skilled workforce and for the perception of their business. Businesses have incredible influence to stop violence and uphold children's rights, not only through their own workforce, but also through the influence they carry with the community. The development of actions to protect the most vulnerable children, including trafficked children, ranges from care and prevention plans and programs, the construction of evidence, support for national, supranational legislation, as well as detection and prevention of trafficking in all of its activities across the entire value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendra. Vamos ahora con nuestra panelista Mariana.
And now let's go on to Mariana, our panelist. Welcome from Mexico. The organization Sin Trata has been gathering information specifically on drug trafficking, on people trafficking. Tell us, what type of exploitations do we see and how can we make sure that this trafficking becomes apparent as well known? Could you also provide a good method of to report all this and to identify all this? As the other panelists said, one of the many other problems that we have is a problem of identification. Less than 1% of the victims that we estimate that exist in the world and in the region are identified. 99% of the victims are not being made aware of and they're not identified today. We're in the United States. 80% of the victims that have crossed the borders went through official cross points without being recognized. This doesn't have to do with the fact that they're not identifiable. We haven't generated the ability to identify them and coordinate and identify them. The identification of victims has to do with the responsibilities of governments, of civil society. And what I'd like to comment today is that this is a responsibility of the private sector, not only from the perspective of the identification per se and prevention. The last report by the United Nations on crime mentions an important change of the trends and exploitation profiles in the last 15 years. Today, we identify victims that we didn't recognize 15 years ago. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist. It means that they had been there for a long time, but we hadn't had the right legislation in order to identify them. We didn't have the mechanisms to access justice. If the countries have been able to identify all of these methodologies in order to identify people that are victims of people trafficking, in our understanding of this crime, we've also understood that the private sector is involved in various stages. This is happening in local economies as well as global economies. We've identified this as high-risk industries, as in agriculture, mining, building, housework. But on the other hand, and talking specifically about people trafficking, we're talking about an illicit activity that uses illicit structures in order to move forward. It uses the infrastructure of services that we use ourselves. The victims of people trafficking travel with us. The victims of people trafficking use social networks. They are recruited on social networks. We should remember that after the COVID crisis in 2020, there has been more recruiting and the sale of victims through digital platforms. Victims, as I said, travel the way we do. They use the transportation that we use. And for instance, tourism has a very important responsibilities because it's one of the main principal places of exploitation, especially children and women. For instance, the financial services are also a very clear part of illicit activities. So what does this leave us with? It leaves us with a great opportunity to discuss this with the private sector. And I believe that it has to be a very specific discussion. We've been very generic, and we believe that we can provide the same guidelines. But what we've tried to do from civil society, from Sin Trata here in Mexico, we are trying to work with a number of organizations. We're trying to build a database to see how trafficking starts. What we have is that in our region, basically, this has not been documented. So we've launched a platform. What we've done is that we've taken down all of the data in order to make sure that it's a fillable platform. A person in only 30 minutes, a person who is in the reception area of a hotel, someone who is working at the immigration service can fill this out quite easily. And all of this data is focused on the various private sector structures that are involved in this crime. The data is providing quite a bit of clarity in order to generate information and good practices which are specialized by sector. A practice that I'd like to recognize is, for example, IATA, where there is a number of companies that have to do with airlines, trips, tourism that meet in order to establish agreements on what the best practices should be. So they're elevating all this, they're establishing standards and what are the minimal requirements. They're establishing all this. They're also establishing cooperation mechanisms nationally, federally, and globally. I think that this is a very good initiative. I would like to describe another initiative from a different viewpoint. We have worked with Uber, who is a technology company as well as travel company. We have been able to establish a new policy whereby we send information with very specific indicators. And of course, people who work for Uber know the city better than we do so that they can identify the ongoing trafficking or those traffic victims. We are working with them, and we're working with a citizens group in Mexico City so that citizens themselves report all this. And we're doing this also through other companies, private companies, governmental agencies, and civil society. What you were saying is very, very important. The fact that we're elevating all this and that we can have a practical effect with organizations such as IATA and others. I'd like to announce that the next panelist is in Perth, in Australia, and due to our time change, we have scheduled her to Serena, please.
What are the main work areas of the foundation?
Walk Free is an international human rights organization, and we're focused on ending all forms of modern slavery. So Walk Free works to address slavery and to dismantle its core drivers by producing research and data that guides our global advocacy efforts. We strive to combat the world's persisting structural inequality that allows such injustices to exist. So since 2010, Walk Free has been working alongside survivors and frontline leaders, businesses and governments, as well as faith leaders and communities around the world to tackle one of the most complex human rights issues of our time.
Thank you, Serena. To end our first round of questions, moving on to Anbin. Anbin, welcome to the IDB. We're very happy to have you here. Walmart is the largest multinational retail corporation and the largest private employer in the world. What is Walmart doing to tackle forced labor in the supply chain, And can you tell us a little bit about Walmart's work regarding responsible recruitment of workers?
Thank you so much for having me here at the IDB. I have to say that I'm very glad that you're having this conversation, especially as a development bank. There's so much insight and information that you have to address this issue. It really is a large systems issue. It's a global issue, a cross-border issue. So it's so delightful to be here with you as development experts, as business people, as civil society. And as a representative of Walmart, I'm from the Global Government Affairs team, and Walmart is a large retailer. We employ over 2.6 million people worldwide and have over 10,500 stores in 23 countries, including Mexico and Central America. And as a global retailer, this issue is very important to us. We have a responsible sourcing team, and we engage our suppliers in our supply chain on the responsible recruitment of migrant workers, as well as we have a supplier code of conduct that addresses issues around workforce, around combating forced labor. We do audits according to a risk base. So we look at reports like the Trafficking in Persons report or the list of goods made with forced labor from the Department of Labor and other reports from development banks to understand where the risk is in the supply chain, specifically around particular products, and we audit against that. So we look at our sourcing team, and we also engage our suppliers. Something that's interesting is Walmart has been a leader in terms of the environmental movement. We've had something called Project Gigaton, which is taking carbon emissions out of the environment. And so we have our suppliers report according to science-based targets. And we're beginning to also have them report on their policies to address recruitment of migrant workers so that they can begin to index their work, compare their work, have best practices. And we host them in our headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas, where suppliers compete to move towards better practices. So a lot of the work is in our own supply chains. We've also, since we've made the commitment to make responsible recruitment the industry norm, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, since 2016, we've invested over $40 million from Walmart Foundation, particularly around this issue of combating forced labor. And some of that work is around rule of law. Some of that work is around, I heard earlier, worker voice apps and tools for worker voice. Some of that is around vessel monitoring systems. Some of it is studies. Sometimes we don't know where these issues exist, and so we need studies. So we've invested money to understand where the issues are. And then from a government relations point of view, we engage and dialogue with governments on these particular issues. We look at the United Nations guiding principles. The state has the responsibility to protect human rights, and the private sector to respect human rights and also address remedy. So I've engaged myself, different governments in Southeast Asia, and talked to them about specific practices around recruitment, around fees that migrant workers pay, beginning to look at issues like worker permits or post-arrival orientation. We work a lot with the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, on their policy networks and initiatives. And I think we understand sort of what rules and laws and policies need to be in place, but also there needs to be enforcement of those laws, and labor inspectors that have capabilities and technical awareness on how to address these particular issues. So there's a lot of resources that need to be put into the system. So those are sort of some ways we really look at our own supply chains, look at philanthropy, and look at government engagement. And what's something that I had mentioned, the responsible recruitment of migrant workers, businesses such as Coca-Cola, HP, Nestle, and others have joined together to say to our suppliers that we don't accept that employees have to bear the cost of recruitment. So what happens now is the most vulnerable person in the supply chain is bearing the cost of recruitment, and they often have misinformation and limited information. And so We're working towards pilots and engaging key suppliers to say that employers need to factor in the cost of recruitment into the cost of goods. And so this is something we're driving multiple ways. It's difficult because this is how the system has worked, where the migrant workers are paying for their passports, their medical checks, often flights, oftentimes could be a quarter, half a year's worth of wages ending up in debt bondage and situations of exploitation. So we're working to think through how we can best address this issue through groups such as the Consumer Goods Forum and the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, which comprises of various multinational corporations.
Thank you, Kendra. I want to focus on something you said about the lack of sectorial data. It's a perfect segue for my next question with Serena. So like Walk Free Foundation, at the IDB, we dedicate a large part of our work to strengthen the quality of data. In the case of human trafficking, it's particularly difficult to collect reliable data. The Global Slavery Index is a recognized source for trafficking in persons estimations. Serena, please share with us the main findings of the latest report with specificities for our region, Latin America and the Caribbean.
So Walk Free produces the global estimates of modern slavery in partnership with the International Labour Organization and the International Organization for Migration. And we just published the latest global estimates last month, which you may have seen coming out. This gives you an estimate at the global level as well as regional and industry breakdowns. Early next year, we plan to publish the next Global Slavery Index, which goes further and gives you that country level data. So it estimates the number of people living in modern slavery at the country level, as well as the vulnerability, the risks. It also assesses the government's response. So what is the government doing to prevent and prevent modern slavery and to protect victims? I'll just share some slides now, which really summarizes the latest findings from the global estimates. So the latest global estimates of modern slavery, which, as I mentioned, we publish in partnership with the ILO and IOM, this came out last month, and it estimated that there are close to 50 million people living in modern slavery today. 1 in 4 victims are children, and 54% are women and girls. And from that number, 27.6 million people are in forced labour, with the remainder in forced marriage. So this number is really staggering, and it represents an increase in almost 10 million people over the last 5 years. And that increase is not just driven by population growth, the prevalence has actually increased as well. You can see here some of the breakdown in terms of what these high-level estimates were last time they were measured back in 2016 compared to now in 2021. And you can see that almost every form of modern slavery has increased. And in particular, you can see there that forced labour exploitation, which is broken down into 3 different forms, has increased across the board. So looking closely at forced labour, we know that 27.6 million people were in situations of forced labour in 2021, and that translates to roughly 3.5 people for every 1,000 people in the world. And you can see there the further breakdowns between the different forms of forced labour exploitation, with 63% in forced labour, 23% in forced commercial sexual exploitation, and 14% in state-imposed forced labour. Looking at the regional breakdown, you can see here that we have a very large proportion of people living in modern slavery in the Asia and the Pacific region, but that there are also millions in other regions. And looking specifically at the Americas, you can see that there are 3.6 million people estimated to be living in modern slavery in the region. And the prevalence in the Americas is at 3.5, so 3.5 people for every 1,000 people living in modern slavery. So you can see this is a really, really big problem. It impacts every country in the world, and it also impacts every supply chain in the world. And that's something that we really talk to businesses about a lot, that it's not just a few high-risk products that you need to be thinking about. You need to look at your entire workforce and understand where those risks are and where this might be occurring. I'll just look a little bit closer at some of the other findings. This one in particular is interesting because while we've known for a long time that migrant workers face very high risks in terms of human trafficking, forced labour and other forms of modern slavery, but this is the first time we've had the data to back that up. And in these global estimates, we found that migrant workers are 3 times more likely than non-migrant workers to be in forced labour. And so I think that's really important, again, as we think about our responses to this and think about what are the specific risks that migrant workers are facing. You know, how does this occur through the recruitment process, through the migration process, and in particular, how do these debts for recruitment fees, debts for migration costs, how do they link to different forms of trafficking and slavery, such as debt bondage? I might finish there in terms of the global estimates, but you know, I would encourage you to all have a look at the estimates and also to look out for the Global Slavery Index, which will be coming out early next year.
Thank you, Serena. Let's go back to Kendra. The statistics regarding child trafficking are staggering. Children make up 1/3 of all trafficking victims worldwide, and in Central America and the Caribbean, they represent 48% of the total identified victims, one of the highest in the world. Please tell us about the work of UNICEF regarding child protection and share with us the main differences between adult and child trafficking.
Thank you for this, and also to the last speaker who really highlighted the extent of the issue globally. And just to deepen that a little bit more, not only are children making up a substantial number of trafficking victims, there is also a gender dimension. Most of the victims in this region are girls. And in terms of exploitation, girls are trafficked predominantly for sexual exploitation and boys for forced labor. And as noted, the trafficking rates are not decreasing. Children haven't had the same life experience to make a sound judgments as adults. We know this is part of child development. And this is one of the reasons that the understanding and definition of child trafficking is different from adult trafficking. There's the international definition comes from the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. And this protocol notes 3 requirements. For something to be identified as trafficking, there must be some sort of recruitment or harboring or receipt of the person. And the purpose is specifically for exploitation. It could be sexual exploitation, it could be labor exploitation. But the difference between child and adult trafficking is in the 3rd element, which is the method to compel the person, which could be by coercion, by fraud, by force, or some sort of trickery. For adults, that 3rd element applies, but not for children. For children, the element of trickery is not required. A child is trafficked if they have been moved somewhere, and that move is for the purpose of exploitation. While how it happened may be important in the response, in our programming response, it is not important for identifying a trafficked child. Ending violence against children is a priority for UNICEF globally and particularly in this region. And trafficking can be violent. In some places, we work with the police and with internet companies to implement programs, for example, to combat online sexual exploitation. And I just want to give you one example of that. And that is where UNICEF engaged in the Dominican Republic with the tourism and telecommunication sectors to prevent sexual exploitation and violence online. You know, with the pandemic, we had an increase in that sort of violence online as well, and trafficking for online exploitation. As a result of advocacy and communication activities, 63 tourism companies in Dominican Republic, including hotels, business associations, and taxi and shop associations, signed a code of conduct against child sex exploitation. And also 4 telecommunication companies were engaged in the We Protect initiative for the prevention of violence through online technical support and awareness campaigns coordinated and implemented with the local and national authorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Going back to Anbin, what is the business case for Walmart to tackle forced labor?
I think with forced labor, it has to start with worker dignity. It has to start with the internal company values. And I think you'd expect me to share this because in 2017, we drafted our first human rights statement and we recognized who our stakeholders are. And so our stakeholders are our customers, our store associates, the communities in which we're involved, but also our supply chain. And so it's the dignity of people, and that is the first and foremost. And I had mentioned the UN guiding principles before. So first and foremost, but furthermore, our stakeholders expect it. Customers expect it. They don't want to buy products that are made or tainted with forced labor. So that is, and I think the younger consumers are really looking, where are these products coming from? Are they certified? What is the story behind the products? I think that is clear, right? And civil society stakeholders expect it. I think something that has been interesting and a shift is that civil society is working with business to address these particular issues around sustainability, around worker rights, recognizing that private sector actors have a lot of leverage in the supply chain and can through technology tools, through insights, through helping with international compliance, we can go further upstream. For instance, in Thailand, I'm part of something called the Seafood Task Force, where we have groups like Bumblebee and Thai Union, major suppliers, but also civil society groups like International Justice Mission, working together with retailers like Costco and Walmart to address these particular issues. So it's that multi-stakeholder grouping. But furthermore, you all are likely aware of the ESG movement. Investors are paying a lot of attention. There's beginning to be more attention around what the metrics are. The environmental movement has had clear metrics around what companies are doing in the environmental space. I think that's beginning to increase around the social space. And so it's something we could all look out for, pay attention to develop, but companies are expected in that way. And finally, I will mention, as far as the business case also, is if you begin to look at the regulation around the globe, around import bans and around mandatory human rights due diligence, there are voluntary initiatives to report on supply chain activities, but they're becoming more mandatory. And when you look at issues like import bans, where the United States Customs and Border Patrol is actually stopping goods that are deemed to be made with forced labor in whole or in part, it really is a market access issue. So I think it starts with the company values, but then also all of the stakeholders, as well as the investment and regulatory environment.
Thank you, Ambin. Sandy, volvemos contigo. Además del imperativo moral, ¿no? Donde es
On top of a moral imperative or a moral commitment, because it's a human rights issue, what incentives does VET use to encourage the private sector to play an active role in the fight against human trafficking? Something we do from the moment that we establish a partnership with the private sector is work on a message, joining efforts to fight against human trafficking is really going to incentivize the work of their partners within the business itself, but it also improves the reputation of the business, the working conditions, as well as productivity of the business itself. Through this message, we've managed to strengthen our partnership with the private sector and make sure that other businesses join these efforts. Another incentive that we provide is to make sure that we don't leave them alone. We support them with technical assistance from the Secretary against sexual violence, human trafficking, and smuggling, as well as through the agreements that we sign with businesses. So to make sure that we don't disrupt the main objective of the business, which is an economic activity. So we support and accompany these processes. We work with human resources, and we also launch campaigns. And then what I was saying before in my previous intervention about a stamp, a CU, it's a certificate for all businesses, tourism businesses, through the Guatemalan Tourism Institute. To this, we've added specific value so that all businesses that receive the CU stamp because of the quality of their services could also implement the campaign Protecting Our Biggest Treasure. This campaign addresses, or this campaign against sexual exploitation of children and adolescents through tourism activities. Another incentive that we have provided is to make them part of the prevention efforts. How do we do this? Well, the survivors of human trafficking, we prevent the survivors of human trafficking from falling again into the hands of human traffickers. We create spaces so that the victims can eventually join, for example, the different businesses. We train them in different types of jobs, as a chef and other things. This is really highly motivating for them because they feel that they're part of the prevention efforts, and we launch a message to make sure that these survivors don't fall into the hands of the traffickers again. Many times traffickers give money to the victims, right? So we need to make sure that we provide the best conditions possible for the victims to move on and abandon that type of life. Another message that we have developed, or something else we have done, is an opportunity for businesses to sell their products in those countries where there are certain international standards in place. Make sure that the supply chain focuses on avoiding sexual exploitation cases and defend human rights. This is the type of incentive that we use for businesses to get engaged in these issues. Going back to Mariana, together with IDB Invest, she carried out a study on the crime of human trafficking and the hotel industry in Mexico. So tell us briefly about the main findings of the study, and in particular, it would be great if you could elaborate a little bit on the main challenges faced by hotel MSMEs, being 99% of the hotels, and how they can contribute to the fight against human trafficking. Well, in Latin America and the Caribbean, sexual exploitation of children, adolescents, and women is one of the most detected crimes. One of the main places where this activity takes place is actually in hotels. So hotels are a very important point of conversation. Another element, and to provide some context, the tourism industry within the private sector has been one of the main ones to get involved in this sense. Kendra mentioned a code, and that is one of the tools developed by the private sector trying to find a solution. And the third point that I wanted to provide you with is that this product of knowledge, this study is developed together with IDB Invest. And this is very important because it talks about the needs of the private sector to fight against this type of crime. Sometimes in civil society, we develop tools that are not necessarily sustainable to be implemented by businesses. So we wanted to understand how businesses could adopt several measures and good practices, how these tools could be sustainable, could be renewed, and could lead to transparency processes within the businesses. So the study was developed in two stages. First, we carried out a research. We reviewed all the different reports in terms of business responsibility, governance of the main hotel chains in the world that are operating in Latin America and the Caribbean, specifically Mexico too, to identify what type of tools they were using, what type of tools the private sector was using. The next thing that we did was to work with MSMEs. We worked with 200 businesses spread throughout the country that have a presence in different regions, on the border, in the Caribbean, in the center of the country. We carried out surveys, interviews, not only with the owners of the hotel, but also with the staff that has a very different experience in terms of human trafficking. We confirmed some hypotheses that we knew. Hotels do see the problem of sexual exploitation very closely. They think it's a very urgent problem. They are afraid that these practices take place in their hotels. They see these practices in other hotels, and they want to implement measures to address this problem. Other findings of the report that we didn't expect it necessarily. Hotels also face risks, not only in terms of the sexual exploitation of children, adolescents, and women, but also bad practices towards the communities where the project is developed, towards vulnerable communities or communities of migrants. So hotels sometimes hire single women, single mothers, and provide very bad conditions. The tourism sector is one of the most informal ones, so there are a lot of risks involved. And we identified something else. Staff of the hotels are also potential victims of human trafficking. They feel vulnerable, they feel exposed, they know of people, and this is very different when it comes to, for example, owners or agents, because the staff feels very vulnerable. What are the different things that we identified? First of all, like you said, 99% of hotels do want to implement different practices and use different tools to address human trafficking. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we don't really have a tool that will allow us to address all the different risks that I mentioned within a single strategy or action in a hotel. There is no single tool focusing on specific risks in the tourist sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. But what we do have is a spillover in terms of tools that have really worked very well internationally. We found a spillover from the United Kingdom's law, Modern Slavery Act from 2015, and it has spillover in Latin America. Why? Because all the businesses that operate in the United Kingdom have to have policies in place for their entire supply chain. We find tools such as the code that was mentioned before that are also being implemented. Big hotel businesses, big multinationals are big partners in this fight. They have a very important regional presence. Hotels represent 34%. Hotel businesses represent 34% of the hotel occupation, and 99% of hotel businesses in Mexico are MSMEs that do not have access to good international practices. They don't have a general security protocol, much less specific one. They don't have the resources to train their personnel, and within their challenges, they're willing to implement good practices, but they don't have the resources to train their personnel in a regular manner. For example, when we design training, we say, oh, it's free training, but hotels need to invest money through allowing their personnel to take part in the training. Another challenge that we identified for our region is lack of trust in authorities. That makes hotels not to want to implement certain protocols. Once they identify a victim in the hotel, they don't really want to contact the authorities because they're they're afraid of retaliation, or they think there won't have any impact. Once we identify the main challenges, but I'm very glad to communicate that we will implement a pilot phase of this study, where once we have identified the different vulnerabilities, we will coordinate multi-sectoral partnerships in order to develop trust between hotels and local authorities, among other things that I hope to share very soon. The tool that we will develop should be easy to implement based on the needs of the businesses that want to get engaged in preventing this type of crime and the fight against human trafficking.
Gracias, Mariana.
Thank you, Mariana.
Start our third and final round of questions. Let's go back to Anbin. This panel is about alliances with the private sector to combat trafficking in persons. How can different stakeholders, the private sector, civil society, organizations, and governments collaborate with Walmart to tackle forced labor?
My fellow panelists and also panelists before have really done a good job in mentioning the vulnerabilities in the system. And I remember years ago, over a decade ago, when I first learned about this issue, I was in Cambodia and I spoke with an NGO on the ground. And the leader of the nonprofit organization told me something that I won't forget. She said, traffickers collaborate very well because they have one motive, which is the dollar, other forms of currency, global currency. So they figure out when laws are put in place or when border police come, they move their routes, they figure out what to do. All that's to say there's a lot of collaboration on the wrong side. But when we think of the trafficking issue, there is accountability that is necessary in terms of government accountability, business accountability, and tackling the issues of traffickers. And so we need to bring all the stakeholders together to address these particular issues. Another area that I see too, and I'll get back to the question, is survivor and like worker voice tools. We really need their insights and informed experiences to bring to the table to tackle these issues. So often their voices are left out, and they, in a way, leaving the voices of survivors out also marginalizes them a second time after the trafficking experience. So we need to think about how to do that in a way that is thoughtful and respectful. But as far as collaborating together, I believe that there is such an ecosystem. The main thing is right now, there's a situation where trafficking occurs and the cost to the trafficker is low, and the impunity in terms of rule of law and penalization, that cost is not high enough to stop the trafficking. So how can we all work together? We need all of our systems to work and all of us to identify what that looks like. So in each country, it's going to be different. And in terms of rule of law, in terms of labor inspectors I'd mentioned before, in terms of particular challenges, I'm more familiar with the labor supply chain, but what are the systems? Are workers free to move? Do workers have the tools they need to report issues? Are they vulnerable? Do they know their rights in their contract? I'm very fortunate to have an interpreter today, but often workers are in a place where they don't know the language. And so really working together to tackle these issues is so crucial. I think it's sort of a obvious question, but how we actually do it is more difficult. The fact that we have to cooperate and collaborate is something that is apparent, but how we get together, build pilots, focus on key countries, identify issues, have leaders and stakeholders begin to think through what the particular issues are in the country and to build coalitions around that. I think that's the exciting work. The fact that we have to collaborate is apparent, but how we can do it to tackle acute issues specific to regions, specific to migration corridors, we We had heard from the woman from Trinidad and Tobago about Venezuela. So that's a very specific problem. So how can those countries collaborate, or the IDB address that particular issue? That's where it's interesting, where we can tackle specific issues in manageable chunks. And I think we need to stay encouraged, because I think too, if you're a victim of trafficking, even though the numbers are so large, like Serena mentioned, over 20 plus million in situations of labor trafficking and more in sex trafficking, if we can solve problems around the world and learn and pilot, we are coming for those people. We are trying to address those issues. We are addressing those issues related to what Kendra said, for children, for women, for men who are vulnerable. So it's so crucial. We just need to get smart on what needs to get done, and to focus the way that the other side focuses on collaboration.
Thanks, Anbin. Mariana, volviendo contigo, con base en la experiencia del trabajo sin
Going
trata,
back to you, based on the work that you've done, what is the business case so that a business works on preventing human trafficking? Is it about sustainability? It's about operations? What has your experience been? Well, going back to the example that I provided before regarding hotels, it's a good example. When we finished the report, I presented it for the first time during the Sustainability Week of the IDB Invest. And during this week, there are meetings of different business representatives, and the main topic was the environment with the gender approach. And I started chatting with people, with the organizers of the event, and they asked me, why are we talking about human trafficking when we're talking about sustainability? The approach of the study had that objective, understanding how business people see those practices to address this challenge. Why? Because we want to line up the business objectives with the human rights objectives. Why within IDB Invest? Because you need an ecosystem to incentivize this type of practice from different fronts. For example, in the case of the hotels, hotel owners understand that implementing measures is preventive. They really understand that they want a certificate to put on the door of their business, certifying that that type of behavior is not allowed in that hotel. Why do they do that? Because they think that that way they also prevent other type of activities related to organized crime groups. We also identified the prevention of penal responsibility. If a hotel has trained their staff, for example, and has a policy in place, they can protect themselves from criminal responsibility when there is a case in the hotel. There are other types of benefits, commercial benefits that business people understand. They understand they can establish commercial partnerships, that they can have access to credit, and that it improves their reputation if they have those practices in place. So really, hotels call us continuously asking for training because they want the certificate. In fact, during our research, what happened was that hotels were telling us, we've seen certain situations and we don't know how to react. We don't know what to do. So there is urgency in order to work together with businesses, with the private sector. We are a civil society organization. We didn't have the right language in place, the right tools to talk to businesses at the same time that we were talking with the public sector. One of my colleagues said that this type of for us the multi-sectoral collaboration has to be at the core of the business activity. Why? Because if the main obstacle in order to report and implement protocols has to do with trust in authorities, based on our experience, we evaluated an RCT in order to see how we could increase trust in authorities, and we saw that when you see a solid partnership between the government and civil society. If you have an anonymous phone line, for example, that really increases the perception of security, among other things. So really, it's about all of us. We all need to work on developing an ecosystem where there is a clear incentive for businesses to implement certain measures. Sandy, I'm going to go back to you. Could you talk a little bit about the main challenges that this VET has faced in reaching out to private sectors or industries when it comes to fighting against human trafficking? Well, we faced several challenges. Guatemala is a country where we have a lot of cultural and linguistic diversity. That has been one of the main challenges that we have faced. We need to break through certain paradigms. We have different social and cultural actors in certain areas of the country, and they show certain behaviors, and that prevents them or us from identifying victims of human trafficking. Another challenge is how to reach all these businesses. They play an economic role, and they could also be used by transnational organized criminal groups. They need to understand how important it is for them to identify the situation. And then at an international level, Guatemala is a country of origin, transit, and destination, but also return of victims of human trafficking. One of the challenges that we have identified in this sense is the need to standardize good practices for the supply chain, especially with those businesses, with technology businesses. We need to standardize legislation. It's important for us when it comes to detecting and preventing human trafficking, especially when the crime is against children and adolescents. Thank you. Serena, going back to you. ¿Cómo puede
Detecting cases, providing support to victims and survivors? Please share with us the experience of the Walk Free Foundation in working with the private sector. Specifically, which projects, toolkits, and initiatives has the foundation developed to support the private sector, and what lessons have you learned?
So as I mentioned before, we know from our research that trafficking and slavery impacts every country and every supply chain in the world. And we know that forced labor and trafficking for the purposes of forced labor are as close as the clothes on our back, the coffee we drink, and the phones and devices we're speaking on today. But we also know it's not just these few high-risk products. If you look at the supply chains of any product, there's modern slavery risk, whether it's the raw materials, the processing, or the manufacturing. So at Walk Free, we work with the private sector in a number of ways. We work directly with businesses, in particular industry groups that are collaborating to improve practices. And we have a number of tools and guides to assist with this. The latest one that we published is a response and remedy framework, which we designed together with a number of businesses to really help them put a plan in place for what happens when you do find a case of modern slavery or trafficking in your supply chain. How should you respond, and how should you ensure that you are providing access to remedy for victims? We also work really closely with the financial sector. So we helped establish a group called Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking. And we're now working with a group of investors across the Asia Pacific region, and collectively they have close to $8 trillion in assets under management. And we're working with them to engage companies in their portfolio to address modern slavery risks. So these investors include large pension funds and asset managers across the region. And the group's also very active on the policy front. So at the moment, we're working with them to make a submission to government to strengthen modern slavery laws here in Australia. We also have been working with stock exchanges. So last year, we partnered with the Stock Exchange of Thailand to publish modern slavery guidance for companies listed on the exchange. And this included guidance on industry-specific risks for Thai companies who are listed on the exchange, as well as guidance on how the companies should respond to those risks, and importantly, what they should what they should report on, what they should disclose to the market. We also created a online modern slavery benchmarking tool. This is on our website. It can be used by companies anywhere in the world to assess their progress in managing modern slavery risks. So the tool essentially asks you a number of questions. It's a short survey, and then it tells you what your company is doing well, what you should do to improve, and what you should disclose or report. So it's really designed to help companies improve as they can take away their results, which is essentially a to-do list. You know, here are the key things that my company should do to improve practices. And finally, another way we work with the private sector is through our strategic impact fund. So we invest in companies that are creating the technology and tools to improve practices. So this includes worker voice tools and worker grievance mechanisms, as well as data-driven risk assessment tools and technology that help verify claims and promote transparency. So I guess through all of that work, we're thinking about the whole ecosystem in terms of how modern slavery exists in supply chains and looking at, I guess, different stakeholders and the leverage that they hold to really improve practices. I think all of the tools I just mentioned are on our website, so I'm happy to also send through links to those if that's helpful.
Thanks, Irina. Kendra, we know UNICEF has vast experience engaging with the private sector around child protection. Could you please share with us an example of a promising practice from another region regarding child trafficking?
Well, I can think of a number of examples that we have, such as in the Maldives, where we partner with hotel chains to train staff on recognizing potential trafficking scenarios and how to respond. We also, in this region and elsewhere, we work with governments on helplines that a traffic victim and others can call to seek assistance, or if necessary, an immediate response that might be necessary can be put in place, like a response can be put in place right away. And often these helplines are free thanks to the support of the private sector. In South Asia, for example, there are efforts to have a common number across all of the 8 countries, recognizing that for in the case of trafficking, a lot of it while it's in country, it is also cross-border, and so having a common number we find helps for an easy access for the trafficked victim. In Mexico, we've worked with hotel chains to provide emergency shelter for women and girls, and sometimes their families, depending on the situation, who have faced violence. And in Europe, we have just recently released a guide for frontline responders, notably recognizing the Ukraine crisis, which was mentioned in the previous panel. And that's for the early identification of trafficked children. So that guide helps businesses, helps any frontline responder, anyone who is in touch with children, who may be in touch with children, to identify potential risk factors and therefore potentially activate a response to the trafficked, to responding to the trafficked person. That guide considers who they are with, how that child identifies themselves, how the people who are with identify themselves, the documents they have, and behavior. So those are just a few examples. And we really welcome all action with businesses to be able to help us identify and respond to trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendra. Desafortunadamente, eso es todo lo que tenemos tiempo hoy.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. I would like to thank our panel members for their participation. This debate has allowed us to get a very complete, comprehensive overview about the importance of partnerships across sectors to fight human trafficking. I will now turn it over to Adela and thank Adela and our audience for being with us today, and all of our organizers, of course. Thank you, Isabel. I'd like to thank our panel members, and it's been such a privilege to listen to you. It's incredible how much the private sector can do. We have a motto at the bank. We say we improve lives, right? Improving lives. So, and you, based on what you're telling us, you're saving lives. So that's very moving. This concludes this technical dialogue on the trafficking of persons in Latin America and the Caribbean. If you haven't filled out our survey yet, please do so. It's very easy to do. Just scan that QR code and it will be very helpful. We work with knowledge and we know that you learn by doing, by experiencing, and it's been such a wonderful experience to be here with you. On behalf of the IDB, I'd like to thank you for your participation and engagement, and please keep an eye on our social media to find out about new events that we'll have. We'll have one on national security, citizen security, and justice as well. And there's our behind the scenes team. I would like to thank them. I'd like to thank our interpreters who have made this knowledge available to all: English, Portuguese, Spanish. It's a luxury for us to be able to have all three languages here in this meeting. And it's been such a privilege to have all of you here in a packed room after the pandemic. And we hope to see you again soon. Those of you who are here with us, we'd like to invite you to La Plaza for a nice lunch. For those of you who joined us online, we're sorry you can't join us. And see you soon. Goodbye.